My baby dolls, welcome back to Genesis. As always, I am your host, Ian Kahanowitz, and today, another great episode is coming up for you. The man with the plan, he's not here today, my co-captain and co-pilot. He's off and running. He's on assignment still, but we do have in the studio today, we do have Gerald C. Wood and his fascinating account of Smoky Joe Wood, baseball pitcher and later outfielder for the Cleveland Indians. We're going to get into his life and times, and it is indeed a fascinating book, which we'll be diving into so much information. It's going to be a really informative and educational show. You are listening to my show Genesis on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network with the Zigzag Man, Ralph Tycho. I'm just happy to be on to that, which, again, has a lot of great shows. You got Peter Golubach University. You've got Washington Senators, Texas Rangers history, Minnesota Twins history. You got the Zigzag Man shows himself, which, again, very informative. The network's growing. We have a lot of great programming going to be coming up for you. But now we're going to turn to Smoky Joe Wood. If you don't know about Smoky Joe Wood, I mean, he was probably one of the best pitchers if you look back to the dead ball era. For those who might not know, when you see stats like this, it's mind-numbing. I mean, he had a record of 117. He lost 57. He had a 2.03 ERA. And I think he gets lost to history because he got injured, which was common in the place for the dead ball era. But whenever I mention Smoky Joe Wood on my Facebook page, a lot of people like the post. I usually get 50 to about 100 hits or comments because with this book, Smoky Joe Wood, he's brought to life, and it's a very detailed book. One has to say, hey, 10 years of research I know it took for Professor Wood to go through all this red tape and all this. But the book won, I don't want a Saber Award, but I'll be able to talk to Jerry when he comes on the show. But Jerry, he's a distinguished professor of English Emeritus at Carson Newman University. He is co-editor of Northsiders Essays on the History and Culture of the Chicago Cubs. And without any further ado, welcome to the show, Gerald Wood.
Thank you very much. It's a joy to be here.
Now, let me ask you, this book won an award. What award did it win? It won the Seymour Award, right?
It won the Seymour Award, yes, as the Outstanding History or Biography book of 2014. It also was a finalist for the Ritter Award as the best dead ball era book.
And so let me ask you this question. How did it take 10 years to do the research on this? Where did you have to go? What did you have to do?
Yeah, that's a great question. Sometimes I ask myself that. I have written more academic books in the past, and they never took me longer than a year and a half. And it was sort of part of a spin-off from the Northsiders book on the Cubs. But I got interested in him because I had seen the Ken Burns biography, and we had the same last name, and I thought that's interesting. I wonder why I don't know more about him. I read the Larry Ritter interview with him, which was fascinating. And then luckily, it took a little work to get around some of the red tape, but I was finally able to reach his last surviving son, Bob Wood, who turned out not only to be a supporter of his father for the Hall of Fame, but also had a lot of sports memorabilia that he was willing to share with me, some of which was valuable. After that, I pretty much, I sort of believe in ghosts, that it helps if you go to where the people were. And so over a period of years, I made a point of visiting Colorado, visiting the Boston area, visiting his home place, visiting where he lived in New Haven, visiting as many, the remnants of as many ballparks, even when he was a minor league player, as I could. So I talked to a lot of people at newspapers and especially at historical societies. And then finally, what was most helpful, of course, was meeting Bob Wood, meeting members of the family, and be lucky enough for the people in the family to embrace me. And even though we did some DNA research to see how closely related, and we're not that closely related, they embraced me as Cousin Jerry, and that really helped. Then they told me some personal stories, which were really, really very helpful.
Now let me ask you this: how did you piece together? Did you do the research, do a chapter, or did you do all this research and then literally take the task of just sitting down and writing this tremendously, exhaustively written account?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, each book that I do is a little bit different, but the general picture of this came in very early to me. One of the things was that I knew that I wanted to do it chronologically when I didn't have to, and I didn't want to do it thematically. And part of that was that nobody seemed to know very much about his life. And when you want to cover the life as well as the baseball, then the thematic approach, at least for me, sort of goes out the window. The other thing is that I had this frame that was in my mind almost like a movie. And actually, I've become somewhat of a screenwriter now, and I play with a screenplay about this story. That is that just before Joe Wood died, 6 months before he died, on January the 3rd of the year that he died, he was given an honorary doctorate by the then president of Yale University, whose name just happened to be Bart Giamatti, and I was riveted by this kind of intersection in history of two great figures in baseball. Smoky Joe Wood, sort of one of the greats lost in this story, and of course the rising star of Bart Giamatti, who within 5 years would be the head of the National League, and then of course would become commissioner of baseball, who banned Pete Rose and died 10 days later. And I just thought this was a natural way to structure the book. So it's sort of the beginning and the ending of the book, they just sort of wrote themselves. And after I decided then that I wanted to pretty much follow chronologically. Now the different titles of the chapters changed. For example, on one of the early drafts, I didn't focus quite as much on his relationship with his father. And as I finished the book, then I started to see how much that had shaped his relationship with a number of players, but particularly with Ty Cobb and Tris Speaker, that link back to his father was the key to understanding how in some ways he could be so loyal to those two guys he could in fact lie in front of Judge Landis and sort of take the fall for them in the scandal of 1926 and 27. So then I went back and sort of revised the first long chapter to focus a little bit more on his estranged but also worshipful attitude toward his father, because I thought it explained a lot. And so there were revisions in order to get more continuity, to get clearer threads going through it. But the structure sort of come to me, and I think that's one of the advantages of being trained academically, is that you're sort of trained to think in an organized way, to argue things. Early on, the general structure sort of fell in, that I wanted to talk about his family, that I wanted to talk about, which was really unknown, his minor league career, that I certainly wanted to focus with 2 chapters on the 1912 World Series, because that was so important, that I wanted to be real clear about what had happened in his years with Cleveland, then a long 19-year career with Yale, that I wanted to get into that, and that I wanted to know what he did after baseball. And then after that, it became clear that there would be a chapter called Legend and Legacy, in which and that was the most grueling research part, was to figure out this guy who we sometimes don't even hear much about, actually had been a pretty involved in American cultural history, or the history of baseball, until he was sort of lost after World War II. And so many of the books, even comics, even movies, of the 1930s had appearances that were clearly a reference to Smoky Joe Wood. And so his relationship with people like the actor Joey Brown, for example, became part of that subject. But of course, that had to be late because it took a long time to sort of figure out those things. Luckily, I had been a person interested in film. And when I knew that he had a long relationship with Joey Brown, then I went and saw all of Joey Brown's baseball movies, and there I discovered some fairly important things. That was really the kind of pure research part, but that came very late.
And with Joey Brown, it's funny. His fame is in the 1930s, I believe. But
Yeah.
if you've ever seen the movie Some Like It Hot, he's older than that. But,
Yes. Yeah.
Still funny as hell, That's when, still funny as hell because you have George Raft in the film. You got Tony Curtis, Marilyn Monroe, and Jack Lemmon. But I love the when Jack Lemmon they're riding in his boat and Lemmon says to Joey Brown, for God's sakes, I'm not a woman. And he's like, no one's perfect.
Exactly right. So you have everything from the sort of parody of a gangster movie down to sort of a subtext about people being gay. I mean, that's a pretty big stretch from one side to the other. It's a wonderful film.
It is. And what's very, very, very strange is that Smoky Joe lived a very long life. He died, he was 95 years old. I believe he died on July 27th, 1985. And so he was around. People who used to call him, and he used to love to talk about baseball. Now let me ask you this. It's funny. He was at Yale for a long time as a coach. And you do bring up the Tris Speaker and Ty Cobb affair with Smoky Joe, which we'll get into later. But you also mentioned Bart Giamatti. Now, he revered Smoky Joe, who admitted guilt, but yet he goes and bans Pete Rose.
Yeah, that's a wonderful story in itself, and I was able to talk to a few people about that, and the general consensus was that Giamatti always supported Smoky Joe, and that's a kind of irony and paradox there, that he would go after Rose, and yet he always believed that Smoky Joe Wood was innocent. And that's one of the things that drove my research, that kept me working on this for 10 years, was trying to answer questions like that, like how could these things be? And I think for the kind of writing that you do, if you don't just record the glories but try to focus on how could this be, then you end up with answers that are really interesting because nobody ever asked the question before. And that's where I got into the sort of psychological side of this, on both parts. And on Giamatti's part, I think it had a lot to do with that he, as a child, his father had seen and worshipped Smoky Joe Wood, and that Giamatti had a kind of worshipfulness that he said he was so intimidated by Smoky Joe Wood. See, they only lived a few blocks apart, and he would walk by Wood's house, where Wood often, in his later years, sat on the front porch, and Giamatti was so intimidated that he couldn't even just walk 50 feet up and talk to that. And I talked to people who were there, including the doctor who was taking care of Joe Wood at the time, and they said yes, that it was sort of visible that even when they gave him the honorary doctorate in his home, that Giamatti was sort of quiet, that he was still a little intimidated by this man who was now broken and full of Alzheimer's. That is a fascinating study in itself, and one of the reasons that I've been working on this screenplay, because I think that's amazing. On Joe Wood's side, I mean, he didn't always know Giamatti until he worked for him, but it was complicated by the fact that Joe Wood was a fighter and a fighter for baseball, and he felt that, and he was getting to be a crotchety old man, and he just felt like Giamatti had supported football too much and had de-emphasized baseball too much, so he had feelings about Giamatti that weren't always positive either. And so that was a great interesting friendship that never developed. People who really cared about each other, who really were involved in each other's life, but it never developed into a real friendship But now I think sort of history can go back and talk about these two great figures and how they did, in a sense, serve each other. And there was no question that the major reason for their giving him the doctorate, not only that he was a great baseball player, but that he had been released because of money issues at the beginning of World War II. And there would have bad feelings about that. And his sons knew about that, and they were still living in the small town, and eventually the word got around to especially the treasurer at Yale, and they wanted that fixed. They wanted Joe Wood to be given an honorary doctorate before he died as a way of basically saying, we're sorry that you had to be released during World War II, and we're sorry that you had feelings about that.
Let me ask you this, though, because what a lot of people don't know about the scandal between Trispika, Tycon, and Smoky Joe. It is the third largest gambling, scandal, which Landis, of course, dismissed. Dan Johnson, I think, got sick over it. And Smoky Joe admitted guilt. Your book does say, I think you dedicated about 4 or 5 pages in your book saying, hey, he said this actually happened. What did your research show besides the 2 letters that were produced? Because there has never been, I'm going to say this, there has never been a book written about that scandal. And I was asked to write about it, and I'm thinking about it, to go to do the research on it. Well, what did you come up with?
Yeah, let me give you a backstory and say, maybe you and I should work on that sometime. Here's the backstory. When I got the Seymour Award, Dorothy Seymour Mills was there, and she's a very straightforward person. She said, I actually read your book. I don't read them all. I actually liked it. It was really good. I said, thank you very much. And she said, one weakness. You have some wonderful things to say about that scandal. That should have been a chapter of its own. You have it spread out in 2 different chapters, and it's sort of hard to find. And I said, yeah, I know that. And, it was a decision that I had to make, that I wanted to come at it from 2 different angles. And I'm so glad that we get a chance to talk to it, because I feel like Dorothy Mills and you and I both feel that there's really, really, really something here, a completely different new approach to that scandal that I never quite it's all there, but I never highlighted it like I should, because of a lot of reasons, because of its significance to history and how it explains a lot of things. And I've had 2 or 3 other scholars write me, and they get confused right away. Let me tell you a little bit about what I did. I looked at the Murdoch papers, and I looked at the Ritter tapes before he edited them for the book, which is really significant because it tells more. And the Murdoch tapes, he wouldn't let them talk about the scandal, but then off record he talked to them, and then they put that on the tapes. So if you take all the circumstantial evidence, a number of things seem to be clear that nobody is willing to admit. It seems quite clear that Leonard was in the accusations was really angry because Cobb had been involved in making a lot of money in betting on games, and he wouldn't let Leonard in on the action. There's an interview, I think, with Hugh Fullerton where Leonard basically says that. So we know that as a background. We know that Speaker was almost a compulsive gambler. And this is the crucial part, going back to Joe Wood's relationship with his father. Joe Wood at one point said, 2 things that are important. One is, if I have a religion, my religion is loyalty. I'm loyal to my friends. And then he also said, Tris Speaker and I were completely loyal to each other. I would have gone to hell for him, and he would have gone to hell for me. I don't think there's any evidence that Speaker would have gone to hell for Wood, and that he probably in some ways used Wood. But it's fairly clear to me. Also, you need to understand some legal things that some lawyers and baseball lawyers helped me with. Those meetings with Landis were artificially set up as if they were legal, but they were in no way legal, because Landis wasn't acting as a judge, and because Leonard didn't show up, there was nothing legal happening in that. And you also should know that Wood and Speaker and Cobb were being coached by 3 highly paid professional lawyers. They knew that what was going on in that session was not legal, and that they couldn't be prosecuted for anything that they said. In fact, if you read it really carefully, it's pretty clear that whenever they sort of got close to the truth, Ty Cobb just took over the conversation and basically shut Landis down. And Landis let that happen. Here's what seems quite clear to me. When Wood, and Wood later described himself as sort of an agent for all this stuff, not as somebody who was involved with it. When Wood did handle the bets, there were bets, people did bet on the game, but I strongly believe that when Joe Wood said that he bet on the game, he took the fall for Speaker. Speaker did bet on that game. And when he said in Congress, I mean, there's no way to even believe this, he said, well, he and Cobb just got confused about what they were talking about. Cobb tried to bet on it, and he didn't like the odds. The odds had slipped away, and he didn't invest money. Speaker did bet, and Wood said it was me, not him, took the fall for his friend. And Landis cooperated with this because he had sort of changed his position. In 1920, he was a kick-ass kind of guy about the players. In 1926, he wanted to stop the bleeding for all these scandals that had been going on. And he finally decided, okay, I'll let off Cobb and I'll let off Speaker in order to just get baseball to look good again. And what about Joe Wood? Well, he offered to come to Yale to try to fix things with Wood. So he knew that Wood was the one who sort of got in trouble, would be the only one for whom there would be long-term trouble. And it was also under the table, it was clear that Speaker and Cobb wouldn't be allowed to be managers because they were in a position of power. But basically, I mean, my take on all this is that Speaker and Cobb were guilty. And you notice when the judgment was given, Landis says there's no reasonable reason to believe that these guys threw these games. Well, that wasn't the issue. The issue is whether they bet on the games, and in fact they did. And so he sort of, even the judgment itself was away from the issue. It didn't deal directly with the issue. And for baseball history, I'm sure the people who are listening and the people who are baseball historians know this. This is extremely important. At this time, it still wasn't illegal to bet on baseball, although people didn't do it because they were afraid of Landis. And at the next fall, by 1927 in the fall, baseball did institute, the rules that we now have. So technically, when Shoeless Joe Jackson took money in 1919, he was not breaking any rules. But when Pete Rose did, then the rules had been established, and they were established in this thing that involved Smoky Joe Wood. I don't believe, going back to the question, I don't believe that Giamatti thought that sophisticated about it. He just supported Joe Wood because he liked Joe Wood and he didn't want to believe that Joe Wood did it. Actually, Joe Wood didn't do it. He didn't bet. Speaker did, and he lied and said that he did it, and the Speaker wasn't involved because he was protecting a friend. And the whole thing was not legal anyway. And he knew that with legal counsel. That's what I think happened. And nobody's told that story. So someday if we want to try to tell that story, maybe we ought to try to tell it together. That's what and there's a lot of circumstantial evidence that suggested that was true. Another example, people who don't agree with me then say, well, what do you do with the part where Wood said, well, we did bet, but we only bet on our own team? That's confusing because the bet that was talked about was one where they basically bet to throw a game. I believe that Wood was brought in initially. He was talking about two different things. when he was brought in by Ben Johnson, it was about betting on the 1920 World Series, not the 1919, the 1920 World Series. And I believe that Wood and Speaker did bet on the 1920 World Series, and they made money on it. And Johnson initially brought them in. So he was able to avoid the question of throwing a game by saying, we've only bet on our own team. Well, they did in 1920. They didn't throw that game before then, or they did. Here's the other thing in defense of Joe Wood. In the game that's talked about, 2 weeks before the World Series in 1919, Wood didn't even play in the game. So he certainly didn't throw the game. What he did was he carried the money. He called it being a banker. He carried the money, and the money that he carried around, he said wasn't for Speaker, and he said it was his own money. It wasn't his own money, and it was for Speaker. And that's where he was loyal to Speaker and protected his front. I mean, it's incomprehensible. For example, in the session, somebody asked, I don't know if it was Landis or his secretary, said, did you and Wood ever talk about, you and the Speaker ever talk about this in the rest of your life? And he said, no. They were roommates, for God's sake. They were best friends. Speaker took one of his last adventures by coming to Wood's home and walking around, which is something I dealt with in the screenplay. They were best friends. The idea that they would never talk about this is just incomprehensible. So that's what I think happened. In the book, you have to look in 2 different chapters to figure it out.
But it's funny. My listeners know me. I've been a tax lawyer for the last 10 years. I've been a regular lawyer for 20 years. I do have my master's in history as well as tax and accounting. But there's 4 things that come out of this. Then I want to move on to another point. 4 things. Number 1, Yale didn't punish Joe Wood regarding this because he was ready to come on to Yale that season. And again, we're going back, 7 years before, only because Dutch Leonard got pissed off and decided he wants to make some money. So he's going to get paid, and that whole thing blows up. Now, 2 questions stand in my mind. Okay, 1. Why did Ty Cobb do that? Because he was comfortably wealthy himself in all of his investments, and did Landis let Speaker and Cobb go, like you mentioned, because it would be good for the game. They didn't end up on Detroit and Cleveland. They ended up, I think Speaker was on Washington for a year and then joined Cobb in 28 on the Athletics with Connie Mack. Right. But these are the questions that never really answered.
Yeah. Well, I think what happened in Cobb's case is, well, first of all, Leonard was pissed off about a whole bunch of series, and that it was an interview that I referred to in my book that you might want to look at, where I think it was with Fullerton. And Leonard said something like, well, the problem about baseball is it's a closed corporation. Only certain people get to bet on it. In other words, the big money was in betting, and the point was that Cobb was betting on games regularly and that he wouldn't let Leonard in on the action. So Leonard was pissed off about previous things that had gone on. And Cobb did try to bet on that, but what happened is the odds shifted too much. He didn't get in on the action in time. But Wood tried to make it look like Cobb never intended to bet. And he did intend to bet. He just didn't like the odds, and he backed out at the last minute. The thing with Yale, was Yale believed in, he was a local boy, and people believed in Joe Wood, and they wanted him there, and they thought he was a good person, that he took care of the boys and did the right thing, so they wanted to protect him in that. It's a fascinating story, and you're right, it probably deserves a book, and maybe we should do it together.
I'm willing to do it, Jerry. You say what you
help me out with the paper audit I have on my 2014 taxes.
All right, that's fine with me. I bring the stuff to the IRS all the time. I'm 16-0. I'm happy to say against the IRS since I've gone. Actually, you know what happened to me? The reason why I have this baseball stuff on the radio show is I was vice president of Citizens Bank at the tax department. My job wasn't necessarily to put the taxes together, but to fight the IRS and the state governments. And then I got sick with diabetes and had diabetes for 20 years, and I've gone through 7 surgeries within the last, 4 years, and I almost left the earth last November when my heart stopped at the table, but I recovered, and you were supposed to be on my show last year, but my show got canceled because the networks went down, and then all of a sudden my diabetes started getting better, and then I'm back on the network, and I'm reading books, over and over again. But this is so paradoxical because you know who Dr. Deb Shattuck is?
Sure do. I sure know it.
Yeah, so she said, as I'm speaking to you, the Bloomer Girls are in transit to me. And guess what? Smoky Joe, he was on the Bloomer Girl.
Called Lucy Totten. She was the one who told me that he might have been called Lucy Totten. When he was a Bloomer Girl. Absolutely.
Let's talk about that. He was young. He was about 17 when he was a Bloomer Girl, right?
That's right.
I want you to hear he's gotten to start with the Bloomer Girls, right? So so literally he had to pitch and stuff, and but he didn't wear a wig or anything, I don't think.
No, it's a fascinating story. They had just moved back from Colorado back to Ness City, and the Bloomer Girl team, by a guy named Logan Galbraith, that a number of us are trying to find out more about, who call it the National Bloomer Girls, but actually came from Kansas City. They came into this little town called Ness City, and they would always play against the local team. And Ness City, stomped them. It was like 23-3. And Logan liked the way Wood played and asked him if he would come and work for Bloomer Girls just for the last 3 weeks. And Joe Wood was just a kid. He probably at that time wasn't even 17. And his father had to give permission. And Wood later in life said, I guess my father just thought, we could use the money and it's really comical. So he allowed him to do it. And Wood later reported in the Larry Ritter book that he was so pretty looking that he didn't even need to wear a wig. I mean, it was common that 3 or 4 males would play on the team. One of the interesting things is that Wood didn't pitch very much. Mostly he played shortstop. And usually the males were the pitchers, catchers, sometimes a first baseman, and often a middle infielder like a shortstop. The women were on the team, and Wood even mentions a woman named Egan as being a very, very good player at first base. So there were some really quality women playing for the Bloomer Girls, but it was not close. It was not all female. And as Joe Wood said, only the most rural of the people from in the small towns would understand that wouldn't understand that there were males on the team.
And I don't know if you know who Perry Bomber is. She is an umpire. She's been an umpire for the last 37 years. She does the independent leagues. She does spring training with the Mets. She's been all over the place for the International Women's Baseball Center. She told me yesterday, because I was on the phone with her, I said, maybe you should call in. She hasn't called in yet, obviously. But she called Smoky Joe around 1982, 83, right before he died, and asked about his time on the Bloomer Girls, and he got back to her. And he said, yeah. So he's like, I was on the Bloomer Girls. So I wanted her to call in today because she would have gave some good insight because she actually spoke to Joe Wood. But let me ask you this question. And so many people don't even know this if they didn't do their history. I knew it because I've done the research on it. But 1912 with Smoky Joe, of course he's a Red Sox now, is one of the most prolific pitching seasons of a pitcher ever in the history of baseball.
Right. Yeah, for sure. I mean, on MLB, they have those, the great 9 things that happened. And Joe Wood's year of 1912 was considered the lightning in the bottle year, that it was the greatest single year without almost like a context. I think that was slightly misleading because Joe Wood won 23 games a year before. but certainly it was something that because of his injuries he was never able to repeat. And really it's, right at the top of accomplishments in a single year. There's no question about it that was a wonderful year. And one of the things that's maybe hidden a little bit in the book that I'm glad you and I are getting a chance to highlight is that Joe Wood and Tris Speaker both made terrible mistakes. One of them by a running mistake by Speaker. There was a runner on first and Speaker was on third, a long fly to center field. And Speaker dogged it coming in, and the guy on first got thrown out before he crossed home plate. Wood also made an error. That was on July the 4th of that year, and they lost that game 6-4. Wood had won 10 games before then. People always talk about the game that he finally lost to stop his streak. He still has his streak that he tied with a number of other people with 16 consecutive wins. But if he would have won that game on July the 4th, he would have won 26 consecutive games that year.
Wow. That's
amazing. He'd won 10 games before. He'd won 10 games before that, or 9 games before that. That would have been 10, and then he won 16 after that. So that would have been 26 games. That's how dominant he was that year. It was really an amazing, amazing run that he was on. He was always a humble man, so he always said, well, I was no Walter Johnson. Look who he had backing him up, and look who I had backing me up. So they always had the team. But he was really, really dominant that year. An amazing feat for him. 34-5. It was a great year, and led right into, of course, a lot of the drama about the World Series that year, whether he had pitched too much, when he would pitch against Christy Mathewson, and that was one of the great, tiring kinds of World Series that there ever was. What an amazing World Series and its drama.
It's funny because I'm gonna have Hank Thomas on the show on May 5th. He was the great. Wonderful. He's the great grandson of.
He is.
The grandson of Walter Johnson.
Yeah, you're going to ask him about breaking the curse, right? Ask him this. Bob Wood's no longer with us. He died at the end of May in 2009. But Bob Wood always said that he should get some of the credit for breaking the curse, because after they'd lost to the Yankees 3 games in a row, the Red Sox they had Hank Thomas and Bob Wood throw out the first pitch. And, of course, that was the game that the Red Sox came back, won the rest of the games, and then won the World Series as well. So be sure to ask Hank Thomas if he claims, like Bob Wood did, that the two of them actually broke the curse throwing out the first ball.
I'm going to have to ask him that, because I speak to Hank often. He usually follows me on Facebook, and he's a great guy. Now, Walter Johnson, did he not say, can I throw harder than Joe Wood? Listen, my friend, no man alive throws that hard.
Yeah, that's repeated from so many different angles that it must certainly have been true. There are myths in baseball, but it seems clear that Johnson said that. Wood's only response, he was always a humble man, was, well, that's just like Walter Johnson. What a wonderful human being. But he believed that Johnson was probably faster. But, yeah, they were right there together. There's no question that big game that they pitched on September the 6th in 1912 was one of the great single games of all times, when you had the consecutive win record that Johnson held at 16 being challenged by Wood, and the two of them pitching against each other. And Wood, of course, won 1-0 and then went on to tie Johnson's record but not break it. That was one of the great games, and I was able to find in my book a couple of people who actually were alive and still had seen that game and who talked about that game. So, yeah, that was really great. Their pitching styles were different, and they had a wonderful respect for each other. One of the sidelights, I think, about Johnson, 2 things about Johnson and Wood that came out in the book, 2 anecdotes. One is that they both had a tremendous fear of hurting somebody. And that became one of the dramas of the 1912 World Series, is that Wood had actually sort of fallen apart in a game against the White Sox that year after he hit somebody. And all the people in the audience who were knowledgeable in the 1912 were what would happen when Wood hit somebody. And in the first game, he actually hit Chief Myers, the catcher for the Giants, but he held himself together and didn't get too upset. Both he and Johnson had this terror that they would hurt somebody. And Wood actually, to the end of his life, believed that there was one player that he had hit in a practice game in Hot Springs, Arkansas, and that he had shortened his career. My research suggested that wasn't true, but that Wood was so terrified that he actually believed that he had shortened the guy's career. It shows up in the movie The First Boys of Spring, which is an award-winning documentary where I talk briefly about that, about Wood's fear of doing that. The other more funny story about the two is, and it shows how the respect for pitchers had for each other. He said that he and Johnson had an agreement that when they batted against each other, they would only see fastballs. And he said in one crucial game, Johnson threw him a curve to strike him out, and he said, "Okay, then it was game on." After that, I would start throwing curveballs to Johnson as well.
And you know, Jerry, what people don't understand is that the reason why these guys, I think, were so afraid of hurting people was because the balls weren't like they are today. The one ball usually lasted the whole game. So it was spit on, it had mud on it, it had tobacco juice on it. It was hard to see. Not to mention there was no lights in any of the stadiums here, so you played until darkness, which I think you mentioned. This is why we have an eighth game of the World Series in 1912, because I think it was called during darkness. One of the games was declared a tie due to darkness. You know, for Smoky Joe to throw that hard a ball that looked like cabbage, and we didn't have radar guns back then. I'd have to say he had to get the speed up to at least 100 miles an hour, even with that ball, because he even said, Smoky Joe, I threw so hard I thought my arm was going to fall off.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, he was humble, but every once in a while they would talk. Bob told me one time that he said, "Dad, did you ever think you might have thrown the ball 100 miles an hour?" And he said, "Yeah, probably faster." And he also said in that very famous ending to Game 1 of the World Series of 1912, when he had runners on the tying run and the winning run on second and third, and he struck the first one guy out, and then he had a 3-2 pitch on a guy who had never struck out in the Polo Grounds before, and struck him out on a pitch. It was probably high and outside. And later somebody asked him about that pitch, and he says he probably never saw it.
Right.
He said it was the fastest pitch I ever threw, and he probably never saw it. So, every once in a while he would admit to how fast he really was.
And, during the 1912 series, when you think about it, Christy Matheson versus Smoky Joe Wood in the last game of the series, that's huge. That's like, going Sandy Koufax against, Lenny Ford in the World Series or something like that, or maybe Randy Johnson against, Roger Clemens in 2001. We're talking about a marquee matchup, but he hurt himself there because he pitched the day after. I think he gave up 6 runs to the Giants that day, and I think what happened was he came in and he did have a save, but he got injured, and now he's starting to think, because again at that time it was very, very common for pitchers to only pitch a few seasons and then be dumped because they're used like a racehorse is done. You're done. But he was always a good hitter. How did he make that transition from being a marquee pitcher to a good hitter?
Yeah, that's also a wonderful story. I think there are 2 great stories about Joe Wood. One is what he accomplished when he was at Boston. It's like you say, his earned run average was 2.03. Actually, they tried to get him to pitch for Cleveland, and he was very ineffective. His real earned run average, except for at Cleveland, was 2.0, and actually was slightly under 2 with the Red Sox. That's how good he was. So one of the things was the story of the natural, the young phenom who's so good and then gets hurt. The other story, and the Cleveland press was onto this. They even called at one point Joe Wood, in some ways, a better player than Speaker because of his heroic return. I mean, the second act and the second story is Joe Wood's courage and persistence in making himself into an everyday player after he was hurt. They brought him to Cleveland thinking that he might still be able to pitch, and it was under the influence of Speaker, who had been traded there, and Speaker brought him over, and Wood unfortunately had been taking the year off and trying to, partly because of a labor dispute over salary, which he was always involved with, but also because he tried to get rehab his arm and got sort of involved with a chiropractor who told him all the wrong things. But he hoped and believed that he was a better pitcher, and he came back and he tried to pitch for the Indians, but he just couldn't do it. And so he was made into a position player. Partly it was luck because it was 1918, and there were so many players who were in the war that they really were looking for position players. There was a weakness on the clubs, and they put Wood in, and he started hitting. What he said simply was, I got a bigger bat and I choked up more, and I tried to not strike out. To him, that was the secret, was to keep the ball in play. But it turned out that he was an amazing, this is another story that doesn't get told, is what an amazing clutch hitter Wood was. That his RBI per at-bat percentage was better than Speaker's, and it was right up there with Cobb's. I mean, he never hit high well, that's not true. In 1921, he actually hit 366 and was hitting over 400 well into September of that year, and then trailed off at the end and hit 366. Generally, we didn't hit for a high average, but he was a tremendous clutch hitter. The thing that probably qualifies his fame as a position player is a guy named Elmer Smith, who was a great power hitter, who was a left-handed hitter and who played the outfield for the Indians, and they had a very short right field fence. And so when Speaker became the manager, he would platoon Wood with Elmer Smith, who hit a lot of home runs. And so for a couple of years, Wood was actually platooned and didn't play as much. But as soon as he went back as a full-time player after they traded Smith, he hit 366. And in his last year, drove in 98 RBIs in the last year that he played. And he was only 32 years old, but he was always interested in money. And Yale made him an offer to give him the same salary he had in the major leagues. And he had 4 kids, and he said, well, if I can, get a long-term pension or whatever and be a coach, I'll do that. And so he left at 32, and he could have played for 3 or 4 more years. I mean, one of the questions I always get is why isn't he in the Hall of Fame? And part of it has to do with that he was a unique player. The other thing is, of course, just the timing of history. I mean, this is 1922. The Hall of Fame didn't come in really with any effect for 15 more years. If Wood would have known there was going to be a Hall of Fame, maybe he would have played for 3 or 4 more years. All he needed to do was get his numbers up, because he had a lifetime batting average that was higher than that of Harry Hooper, who's in the Hall of Fame. And as a position player, he hit 298. The other thing about him that's sort of in the book is he became an outfielder. But before that, he also was a utility player. So he played first base and he played second base. He was a very versatile, natural athlete who was good at all kinds of things. I mean, at one point, they even tried to get him to be a professional pool player because he was such a natural at that as well. He was sort of physically the natural. He could do anything in sports.
And it's funny because he did go on to Yale and he did stay for 20 years until World War II. I know he coached his son Joe, and who pitched briefly for the Red Sox. But here's a little tidbit. We're talking 1981. Wood was present at Yale University between Yale and St. John's, and actually saw a pitching duel between Ron Darling and Frank Viola.
That's right. Yeah, That's one of the great stories, Roger Angel's, The Web of the Game. He told that story. And if people haven't read that story, I mean, they need to read it. It's just one of the greatest baseball stories ever. And Joe Wood sitting there with the watch that he was given just by a manufacturer. It wasn't an official thing for the 1912 World Series. And so Angel thinks about, I wonder if Darling will ever understand that I was sitting here with Wood, and that Wood had had the watch on that connected him all the way. So indirectly, he was connected back to the 1912, and would Darling ever appreciate that he was in a 1-0 game, just like Wood had been with Johnson. Darling didn't win, but that he was in. That there was this web of the game that history sort of repeats itself. This is a side story for my people might be interested in. There was an auction of things coming up, and if there was one thing that I would have liked to have had the money, unfortunately, being a teacher all my life, I didn't have the money. That watch actually came up for sale, and I wanted to buy it, and the starting price was $5,000. And that was about $4,000 more than what I had.
Oh my God! Well, let me ask this, because I'm going to ask the final inquiry here, and this is very interesting. Again, Lawrence Ritter and Donald Honig in 1981, like you said in their book, The 100 Greatest Players of Their Time, they explained what's called now the Smoky Joe Wood syndrome.
Right.
Player of truly exceptional talent, but a career that was curtailed by injury, should still, in spite of not having had career statistics that would quantitatively rank him with the all-time greats, be included, in their list, and as well as the Hall of Fame.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I hope that helps keep up Joe Wood's name, just having that syndrome named after him. But that's certainly true, and he's the best example of somebody who had that. And I think that's, in some ways, the reason I was so willing to hang with this book so long, is because Joe Wood had a unique history in baseball. I mean, the only person you comparing to as a pitcher and a position player is Babe Ruth. But Babe Ruth never got hurt like that, so you don't know how comparable they really were. And then to have him be such a natural athlete but be sort of lost to history, and then to have that second act that was just based on retooling himself, that's just unheard of. And so in some ways he's hard to evaluate where his career was, because there were so many qualifications and so many injuries, frankly. I mean, he had way more injuries. He had like 5 major injuries, including an appendectomy and a broken toe from when Speaker opened up a door on him. He, of course, had that finger problem that became a torn rotator cuff. He had all these kinds of injuries as well that really made him unique. You often have now players who have torn rotator cuff or elbow injuries, and that might end their career. But Wood had all kinds of injuries that that kept him from establishing the kind. He never stopped, but kept him from establishing the kinds of numbers. For example, he lost most of the 1913 season. And the best example of the syndrome, and people, this eludes people as well. Smoky Joe Wood was pitching in 1915 with a torn rotator cuff. I have definitive evidence from that, because the guy who took care of him, Leo Cooney, who was his gerontologist when he was in his old age and had Alzheimer's, actually checked, and he said, that the finger injury had turned into a torn rotator cuff. And it was clear that in 1915, Joe Wood was pitching for the Red Sox with a torn rotator cuff. And he could only pitch like every 3 weeks, because after he pitched a game, he couldn't lift his arm high enough to get his money out of his pocket. He couldn't change his belt. It hurt that much. But with that That's his reality. He had the lowest earned run average that year in the American League, 1.49, and had the highest winning percentage. He won 15 and lost 5. And a 9-game winning streak, pitching with a torn rotator cuff. I mean, that's the Smoky Joe syndrome right there in 1 year, when you can do that while pitching with a torn rotator cuff. I mean, that's unheard of. And of course, one of the sad parts is that he didn't have the access to any of the kind of medical procedures that we have now. He might have been able to come back.
I had a great time today, Jerry. I hope you did also. Am I leaving out anything you might want to tell the folks at home listening to this that maybe we haven't mentioned?
No, I'm most fascinated by your take on that 1926-27 scandal, and I'm fascinated and really encouraged by how much you know about it and how you think that's been so influential. And I think people, if they're interested in my book, of course, well, first of all, probably do the paperback because it's just got a couple of small errors corrected. But also piece together the two places where I discuss that. And I think you'll see they're a very fascinating kind of thing. And if anything else, also focus on the legend and the legacy chapter, because people don't know how much Joe Wood, he's not so much alive now in baseball history, but throughout the 1930s and even the 1940s, reading a comic book about him, he was really well known in baseball lore, and Joey Brown made a clear reference to him in a movie. So he was an interesting guy.
No, I had a fantastic time, Hold the line, because I always end the show this way. And then everyone seems to hang up on me. I don't understand that. But just hold the line. Folks, I hope you had a great time, the show. As you see, Professor Wood, just a wealth of knowledge. Go out, get Smoky Joe Wood, the biography of the baseball legend. You won't be disappointed. You're going to learn a lot of things like we spoke about today. As always, I am Ian Kahanowitz. Gerald C. Wood. And in the immortal words of Edward R. Murrow, folks, good night, good luck, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.